one of the major themes and one of the infamous excerpts of the book is that you wrote that microprocessing will subvert and destroy the nation state. And I should remind the audience that this book was written in 1997. So maybe you could just start unpacking that a little bit for us. How did you come to see microprocessing or digital technology, I guess more generally, as this force that would unwind and ultimately destroy the dominant institution in the world today, which is the nation state?
Well, I have had a kind of gamey interest for a long time in the underlying forces that alter the costs and rewards of the use of violence and force in the world, which I think is a very important factor always in the outcomes that we see. I was particularly smitten by the impact that gunpowder weapons had on the size of governments and how they function. They were a huge tidal force that raised the scale of government. And government has grown, governance has become a matter of gigantic scale. And there are artificial economies to scale in government today, which have to do with the ability to mobilize huge divisions, which maybe through the first half of the last century actually were based on what I call mega political reality, that having a bigger army and more tanks made you more successful. But then this all changed. The microprocessor is one of the things that changed it. And I could foresee that it would really be possible for a single individual, which is going to the smallest possible scale, to have his own army of bots, using AI and whatever, to create havoc, if not create an arrangement of power. And there's always a lag in these things, and there's always a negotiation, which is either explicit or it's implicit, like the Putin negotiation over the land corridor into eastern Ukraine. He puts 100,000 troops or more on the border, and everybody's asking, what's he want? And so something will play out that will create a balance between Ukraine and Russia, which is not an encouraging thing from my perspective, because I think that Putin is a sore loser. He's shown that. I mean, he was like Hitler, who was a sore loser about World War I, and his biggest animating desire was to overturn the Versailles Treaty, which had happened 20 years before, maybe. And Putin's big gripe is with the fall of the Soviet Union. He thinks this is a great tragedy, and he wants to reaccumulate it under the influence of Russia, in a way. And I think that when you get a mad dictator who's crazy about fighting recent history, you're really on treacherous territory. You're not really sure what he's going to do. And there's a danger that there would be a war, a big war coming out of this, because I don't trust President Biden and his advisors to get the better of it. And I have thought about the analogy with President Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I think is a good one because it entailed finding a win-win solution out of a treacherous moment. And Kennedy did it by proposing to remove the intermediate range missiles that the US had stationed in Turkey in exchange for Khrushchev pulling back the missiles in Cuba. It worked out. The world was not destroyed. We didn't have New York City bombed. But after the Soviet Union fell, it was confirmed that Khrushchev was planning an attack on New York City with hydrogen bombs, which would have been a devastating moment in our lives and those to come after us. So I think maybe we need somebody with the brains that Kennedy had at the helm today, and I'm not sure we do with Biden. He seems a little sleepy, as Donald Trump said.
You know, something else you wrote in the book here, I think core to your point here is that we almost need to get away from the arbitrariness of political whim or opinion, right? That seems to be this great danger, that you have someone like Putin with so much power, and he's in a position that really his decisions affect the world disproportionately. So the more we can get to a world that's governed by, I guess, in Bitcoin, it's popular to say rules instead of rulers, the more stable the world will be. And one of the things you wrote in the book was that, quote, efficiency will become more important than the dictates of power in the organization of social institutions, unquote. So my question would be, what does this mean for the dominant, what I call analog age institutions, which are everything pre-internet? You know, the dominant institutions that remain today are nation states, central banks, increasingly non-governmental organizations like the World Economic Forum. What does this mean for them? What is it, this shift towards efficiency and away from the dictates of power? How does this transform the social institutions that we are familiar with?
Well, it renders them anachronisms. And anachronisms don't all disappear at once. You know, you can look at the fall of Rome as an example. Rome had been, talking about the Western Empire, had been very, very powerful, and everything depended on the emperor, and the senators and others had great influence. You can look at the pick up any theme from the late days of the Roman Empire, and you see the institutions of the empire being not necessarily subverted, but displaced, because people themselves could see that things were falling apart. And this created a kind of tidal force toward feudalism, because individuals in small towns or big towns in Italy and other places in the Roman West, in Gaul particularly, started affiliating with large magnates in their local area. So they would have some protection when things all went to hell. And they did go to hell. And this became the basis of feudalism, because the local guy became the duke, or maybe just a baron, or maybe even an earl if he was lucky. And the people who affiliated to these local warlords early on were more successful than the ones who were left out in the cold. And I think that what we're seeing here, what we've already begun to see, if I could point out, is that smaller entities are more efficient. And you can see that if you look at the countries in the world that have the highest aggregate life expectancy, they're not big countries, though Korea and Japan are in the mix. But the ones that are the highest are Monaco, San Marino, Andorra, little tiny mini states. And they have the highest incomes, the highest life expectancies. And I think that this shows you something that we can easily extrapolate from our own experience as Americans. When we see the blue and the red states, they're all sort of in a tangle over different issues. There's the abortion question, which is an important question to be sure, but it's something that splits people apart. Some, especially the rural people, are much more against it than the urban people. And I think that we're losing a lot of the efficiencies that were created by the Constitution when we had a federal government replacing the Articles of Confederation, which was just a sort of wish list. You know, that we were operating on wishes and printed money, which didn't work. And we tried to create a country with strong money, which is what the Constitution was is it prohibited the states from printing money, but it didn't prohibit the central government from printing money. Which is where we've gone crazy. But this is also a point of interesting contrast, because one of the things that technology has done is create the blockchain, and Bitcoin and the other coins or blockchain currencies are becoming big. They're displacing government control. And I think what we're going to see is an attempt by government to co-opt the blockchain by having a Fed coin or something.
Right.
But that's going to ultimately create, and it already is creating, competitive currencies, which is what F.A. Hayek projected as a way of stopping the craziness. And I was a big fan of Hayek, and he actually liked me. So
That's great. That's a great segue actually to my next question here. So you wrote in the book that, quote, just as monarchs, lords, popes, and potentates fought ruthlessly to preserve their accustomed privileges in the early stages of the modern period, so today's governments will employ violence, often a covert and arbitrary kind, in the attempt to hold back the clock, unquote. So we're moving, it seems like, as a result of the microprocessor and some second order changes resulting from that, we're moving from this world of highly centralized, organized violence to something that looks much more like the monarchical period, right? That was a bit more decentralized, disorganized even. This is a big change for people, right? I mean, we're accustomed to, as you describe in the book, the nanny nation state. We've all kind of grown up under this protective aegis. How should people be thinking about the years ahead? Like, how should they be adapting themselves, changing their lifestyles, making preparations? What are the action items you lay out for people?
Well, I think that the first thing that you need to think about is how to maintain independence, which is not easily done. I have had a hand in starting 3 companies that became worth $1 billion and more, and maybe 4 if you count Canadian money as $1 billion. That's a pretty good record for just sitting around inventing your own work. But still, it's not enough. You need to have, well, I think of my friend Peter Thiel, who is a big fan of the sovereign individual. He's even agreed to finance a conference at Oxford as a retrospective on the book. And I think he's an example of somebody who is pretty close to being a sovereign individual. He's got his own billions, and he's got plenty of interest in technology. You need to have flexibility, I think. You have to be able to pivot, because however correct the ultimate outline of the sovereign individual's themes may be, it doesn't give you much in the way of timing. It doesn't tell you exactly when things are going to happen. And some things drag on forever, you know. You have, the church was in a hegemonic position in the Middle Ages. It didn't just die and go away. It's still with us. And there probably will be some vestiges of government and popular government in a way, but it's going to be a disappointing prize to control the government in the future, because it's not going to have the capacity to move assets and resources and dictate to people the way it does now. But equally, we've read 1984 and other thought exercises about how authoritarianism settles into people. And if you look at something, the long ago writings of Spengler on the decline of the West, he made the very shrewd observation that government by democracy was actually a government by oligarchy, that the governments, democratic governments, would always be controlled by the very rich, which is contrary to the arithmetic that we often suspect is at work.
Right.
You think, well, the have-nots will vote things out of the pockets of the haves, but it doesn't usually happen that way, or at least to the conclusive degree that arithmetic implies.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, one of the things we said in The Sovereign Individual is that popular government would be reduced to a competition between demagogues who are
Mm-hmm.
megalomaniacs for control of the most powerful institutions in the world. And I thought in a way, Donald Trump, who's been very nice to me in his lifetime, was a kind of demagogue in that sense. He's been blamed for a lot of things, and some of them he deserved blame for. And I think you see also the potential rising around in the wake of Trump's presidency for him to be accused of all sorts of crimes, which he probably will be. And he may be indicted. He may need to spend a lot of his money in legal defense against various things that are going to be charged against him because he alienated so many people. So he is a sort of cautionary example to the next person who's elected president. Don't do this, that, or the other. You can't really defy the deep state without making sure that it's disabled by your defiance.
Right.
Other than just pissed off.
Yeah. Great point there.